Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Stirling Bridge, fought on September the 11th, 1297. This video is going to be a tactical history of the battle, which means that we're not going to focus much on the strategic background, but just analyze the development of the battle in itself. This is a relatively famous battle during the first Scottish War of Independence, considerable Scottish victory that on a longer perspective can be considered as a prelude contextually of the infantry victories of the first half of the 14th century that represent this macroscopical phase in medieval warfare. This is a bit different, as we will see now, because it's important in this battle first of all to acknowledge what really the strength ratio really was between the two contenders. But let's simply take a look at the battle and let's understand it better. So first of all, usually medieval battles are fairly complicated to reconstruct because it turns out they're usually better documented, let's say, than the ancient ones. This is something that is often overlooked, and part of the reason why maybe that they are not so famous, aside from the prejudices that still exist largely on the medieval, the Middle Ages and medieval warfare. It's also because people kind of get puzzled by the sum of these sources that are sometimes difficult to analyze altogether. And the Battle of Stirling Bridge instead is fairly simple to learn, because fundamentally we rely only on one source for understanding the exact development of the battle. This is the picture you get normally when it's really not that strange, but for example, compared to those other victories of the first half of the 14th century, this one is under-documented by certain standards, but not in the measure, in terms of how many sources really talk about the development of the battle in detail, right? Not because otherwise this single source, that is the Chronicle of Walter Hemmingborough of Gisborne Priory in the Cleveland area of North Yorkshire, is very well informed. It's considered also reliable. That is something that unfortunately we can't say about all sources. And it's also interesting for the same can be said for the Battle of Falkirk, that has this continuity in the context of the Scottish wars. And the interesting part of the story is that you can, by the way, I'll put you a link to the Chronicle that is obviously in Latin, but it's published and you can read it. It's an interesting read, telling the truth, and I had fun reading it, so I found it fascinating. And now we could add some detail about this source. Let's say probably the author was acquainted to certain people who participated to the battle. He was also relatively close geographically to the area. The English knights, some of the English knights that participated to the battle lived in Yorkshire as well, where there were these border nobility. And in general, it seems that the author was also acquainted to Marmaduke the Twang, and also to Hugh Cressingham. Now we will see who they were, and they had an important role in the battle. So, looking at the battlefield of Stirling, so Stirling had this bridge over the Forth that at the time is not really it's not the obviously the bridge we can see today in there, that was built in the 15th century. It's what is called the Old Bridge. There was a wooden one that whose stone piers have been identified, probably under in the riverbed, and it was probably the same bridge of the battle. And the ancient bridge is located roughly 180 yards upstream to the old bridge that stands today. This position is particularly important because, as you can see from the maps I've put in here, you can't see along the video, is well, probably influenced also the development of the battle in the measure, especially relatively to the meander that you can't see where the English army or part of it that having crossed the bridge was deploying, and we will see it later in some detail. And in the north of the Forth, so where the Scots are deployed, we will look at the armies later. You have roughly 1,000 yards. The Abbey Craig, right, that is located over the Ochil, if I pronounce correctly, hills, that rises some 360 feet over the plain of the Forth, right, and from the other side, in the south of the Forth, instead, you have Stirling Castle, where the English were based, and it's roughly one mile and a half distant, but it's important because these two locations can dominate the battlefield in looking at it, and the two forces initially were kind of, especially the Scottish ones, as far as I understood, were fairly concealed, also because from the Scottish side there was some force. So basically the English couldn't assess the Scottish force aside from other information they naturally gathered in general. Now we'll see also how there were some Scottish knights that also passed from the side of the English, or they were kind of suspensed in the meanwhile. But they didn't quite understand it before they saw it. As we were saying before, maybe I don't remember if I mentioned that, but basically the English had defeated in 1296 the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, extremely easily. Just the vanguard of Varenne, the Earl of Surrey, had been that it was also incidentally the English commander, as we will see now, at Stirling Bridge, had basically annihilated, had crushed them. So it's not that the English probably underestimated the Scots in this battle, and so this battlefield is also very interesting because of all these various meanders of the river that maybe can make us play with the first of all, they give a fairly exact point of reference to understand where the fight actually took place. Secondly, they kind of movement the battlefield a little bit, as we will see also later, right? And something has changed. There is also river fording that was asked by one of the he was actually a Scottish knight, but he was in the English camp that at one point suggested the English commander to make part of the English army to cross towards the west, and this is probably an area that now doesn't quite correspond because of drainage and other works to how he was at the time. However, we can it didn't, at the end of the day, as we will see, not really had an influence on the outcome of the battle, because that option was not taken. So relatively to the forces, and let's pass first of all to about the commanders, right? So at this point, the Kingdom of England has is ruled by King Edward I, that is not present in Scotland at this point. He's campaigning in the Flanders, so with a consistent army, by the way. So the English forces that are marching north to crush the Scottish rebellion are fairly contained, but they were still a pretty substantial army, as we will see now. The commander-in-chief was John de Varenne, sixth Earl of Surrey. He lived between 1239 1304, and he was even related to Edward Plantagenet, as he descended from Geoffrey of Anjou, and by his marriage to a half-sister of Henry III. So he had fought together with Prince Edward in Gascony back in the day, even participating at the famous Battle of Lewes in 1264. That already tells us, a fair deal about his military education, knightly virtues. These are military contexts that reveal actually that there are some of the represent some of the peak of also the development of 13th century tactics. At the time, he had also participated to the arduous Welsh campaigns between 1277 and 1295, and this had also made him rich, given he was granted lands afterwards, and had become one of the most powerful of the Marcher lords, right? And as we have seen before, in 1296 he had defeated the Scots at Dunbar, so he was a kind of a reliable figure. And this makes all the more important what happened at Stirling Bridge instead. Other key figure from the English side is Hugh Cressingham, the treasurer of Scotland, that is definitely is painted even by the Chronicle of Walter of Gisborough as a kind of a negative figure. There is this. He's presented as a sort of unreliable, slippery, haughty, arrogant, and avaricious figure that exploited his office to, hit hard the Scots. And as we will see, he was definitely not popular in Scotland, and he will have a kind of a bad ending, unfortunately for him. And he was effectively in charge of the English administration of Scotland, right? And he also, despite so much Scotland, that he had retired at this point before the campaign against the rebels in Yorkshire, and so he's represented also as kind of a, not really as an idler, but he had this wealth he had accumulated had brought him to the kind of a luxurious lifestyle. He had grown obese and so on. However, he was not devoid of military experience, and in fact he had also served in Wales back in the day. Passing from the there is also this other figure, is Marmaduke de Twenge of Kilton Castle in Cleveland. He would die in 1323. He's considered a bit the hero of Stirling Bridge, especially because of what is written in the Chronicle of Gisborough. And he is a prominent figure that also fought eventually in 1314 at Bannockburn, etc. We can passing to the Scottish side. At this point, the Scottish rebel army was commanded by William Wallace and Andrew de Moray. So William Wallace is this actually shadowy figure from a historical point of view. He actually comes into the scene just in 1297. He gained this enormous fame, historiographically speaking, in his role naturally, and the importance as a military commander during the wars of Scottish independence at this point. But we really know very few about him, about his background, etc. Some people, though, think that he might have gained his military experience from having served actually Edward I during the Welsh campaigns, so maybe he was a war veteran. Some suggest instead he was a kind of a Mordi or an outlaw who was also witnessed probably to have robbed and certain properties, etc. In any case, or both maybe actually. In any case, he proved this great talent and brought the Scots to effectively challenge the English and eventually also defeating them. So especially and his skillful conduct of military affairs in 1297 and 98 makes us think he had gained this previous expertise. Under Moray or de Moray, he died, as we will see actually, after the Battle of Stirling Bridge because of the wounds that he gained during the battle. Was a member of the upper ranks of the knightly classes of Scotland. He had fought as an esquire at the Battle of Dunbar, after which he had been captured, and eventually he had been kept in prison for some time. Eventually he escaped and raised the standard of the revolt in the north once again. He had this relatively brief career, also the dying after the Battle of Stirling Bridge, but also the relation between he and William Wallace are pretty obscure. Also in the chain of command, relatively to the Battle of Stirling Bridge, we don't really know who took which decision. Naturally, it was probably a sort of assembly of all the various, of the veterans, etc., not just these figures, but these were the most important ones. So I decided whether to talk about the organization of the English and Scottish armies at this point, but let's say that we can sum it up in this way. We are at the end of the 13th century, so this is a moment in Western warfare in which lots of things were kind of changing towards a sort of professionalization of the army. Still was still a kind of a traditional feudal idea of what the levies were. The English army at this point was kind of one of the most advanced for many reasons. With the reforms of Henry III, much about after the Civil War, much had been re-put in shape. England had this, for the time standards, a fairly centralized and efficient military administration that is perfectly showed during the campaigns of Edward I, and it heads also in here towards a professionalization, in the sense that the traditional feudal levies that were technically to owe their services for free, since they had received the beneficium for it, is actually had always been ideal. At this point is substantially surpassed. There is the scutage. There is this idea that fundamentally the military service is bargained between the crown and the feudal vassals. This has also brought into the English kingdom a new tendency to probably to rely on other forms of troops. That probably has to do with the rise of importance of the longbow. I made a video recently that should be titled 13th century English armies. So if you really want a bit more of detail, I speak for 2 hours about how English armies were organized at the time, and that can be some sort of it can be definitely useful. The Earl of Surrey's force at this point was probably not, the sources are pretty vague sometimes with numbers, or grossly exaggerated. The Chronicle of Gisborough says that the English were fielding 1,000 horse and 50,000 foot, which is impossible. The more acceptable estimates were something like between 350 cavalry and 6,000, probably also something more infantry from the English side. This force was not, as we will see now, was not fully engaged into the combat, because only a part of the English army managed to cross the Forth before being annihilated, and the the first part that crossed was estimated in, like 150 knights that were the shock element of the English army and of European armies in general, especially feudal armies that could allow this heavily armored horsemen and horses. Actually, a very tiny minority of the horses especially was armored, and we can estimate very orientatively the infantry that managed to cross the Forth in 1,000 spearmen, 800 longbowmen, and something else like other specialist troops, for example, like something like 50 crossbowmen that were in that case coming from the castle of Stirling, from the garrison of the castle. The rest of the English army was, in fact, if you make the count, other 200 knights and troopers and 4,500 spearmen and archers. And looking at the Scottish side, so the rest of the English army eventually didn't participate, and they eventually fled, as we will see. The Scottish army was instead composed very differently. It had 180 knights, so almost one half of the English cavalry forces. The Scottish armies at this time were theoretically still a general levy of, like in the early high medieval tradition. Feudalism in Scotland was, it was developing essentially at this point. Over time, the idea of a clientelary society also makes terms like feudalism pretty blurry. The concept here was rather that the country could field most of the freemen. There were footmen generally. Scotland was one of fairly, say, depressed area. So fielding the ultra elite of 100 of armored knights, etc., was something impossible. So they, where the Scots lacked in quality, they made up with numbers, and they could deploy, make up with numbers and deploy something like good 6,000 spearmen. We know that there were also archers from Selkirk. We can estimate at 400 longbowmen, right? So a very strong bulk of infantrymen that will become eventually during the Scottish Wars as this kind of distinctive character of Scottish warfare, capable also of stopping and defeating the English cavalry charges, and that would prove important, especially for their numbers in this battle. And actually, it's somewhat disappointing to see how the battle developed, also because we don't know about the combat in itself. So, but it's important to, lacking information on that side, to consider the forces involved that can help us to picture more or less why, however, the battle, albeit we know relatively few about its development, might have effectively taken place. So, looking at the opening moves of the battle, so there was this initial, let's say, contact between the James, the Stuart, and the Earl of Lennox, in company with certain other Scots lords that were essentially fluctuating between the Scottish side and the English side, right? And this is partly because the Scottish lords had sworn an oath of allegiance to Edward I after the English occupation, so they were theoretically tied to the English crown. But the point is, naturally, is that their reasons were pretty selfish, as we probably at least, as the situation was still installed fundamentally, but they didn't know which side would have prevailed, right? So they were going back and forth between the two camps and naturally exchanging information about the respective forces and try to to profit from it. And this is interesting because actually these lords promised the Earl of Surrey some reinforcements, right? They were especially telling that 4 armored horse would have come the following day. This was happening on September the 10th, so the day before the battle. And at the end of the day, the 2 Scottish lords came back to the Scottish side, and along the road also they seemingly met a band of returning foragers of the English side, with whom they had some contrasts, and the Earl of Lennox also wounded one of the foot soldiers in the neck with a sword. So when the foragers came back to the English camp, Stirling, they informed the Earl of Surrey about the incident, and they demanded vengeance for that very night for it. So the Earl said, okay, well, let's wait for tomorrow at least, if anything, because this Scots had promised help to the English. So at that point, they didn't absolutely want to make the thing, this promise not be maintained, and then that was this incident naturally put the English on some alert, meaning what's the true allegiance of this to lords, and let's try to win them over from our side. Then eventually the Earl of Surrey retired for the night. He was 66 years of age. He wasn't really in perfect physical form. He had informed in August the King Edward that he was ill, that he wasn't in the necessary shape for command. So in fact he was expecting at this point to be replaced on the Scottish theatre by Brian Fitzalan of Bedale. So aside from this, the day of the 11th September came, and at this point, as far as we know, that at sunrise, the English army began to cross the river. Now, in the bridge, the bridge was only wide enough for 2 horsemen abreast, so it took quite a time for the vanguard to cross. This was the problem. Essentially, the English didn't quite know how strong the Scots were. They probably were overconfident, and they took this chance of making past these 2 men abreast at a time, which actually seems pretty weird, because given the numbers, that relatively contained numbers that we have listed before, this operation would have taken many hours, really like 11 hours. And as we've said before, this was a pretty risky operation because the Scots could have attacked. It's always a very delicate move. And however, this very first movement was called off because the Earl of Surrey had not yet risen at that point, so the vanguard came back along the bridge. So these are all movements that, from one side, they tire the soldiers, and also they make all the army being kind of what's going on, why is something going wrong at this point. The same you can imagine the Scots spying on that, and wondering what the English were doing in the first place. So after Varenne he first of all he did this thing. It was pretty common before the battles in medieval times. It was that conferring the knighthood on several of the squires that were present. The Chronicle of Gisborough, gloomily recounts that many of these squires would have fallen, would fall that day, and only after this, so after other time, the army began to cross the bridge again, but was again recalled. Right, so twice this was halted simply because at this point Stuart and Lennox came into the English camp, right, and the Earl of Surrey was hoping that they would bring the Scottish submission, or at least the 40 men at arms, but basically the two Scottish lords didn't bring either of these two things, and yet they probably still thought that the English could win the battle, so that they came there to basically excuse themselves and try to still appear as non-enemies at least, and therefore hoping that things would get better for them, like keeping themselves in as a sort of hoping that whoever would win the battle would fundamentally not punish them for their weak loyalty. So at this point, the Earl of Surrey decides to send two Dominican friars as fundamentally as ambassadors to talk with the Scottish leaders that were on the Abbey Craig. And at this point, so this was normal as well, that this monks would be sent for it's normal that Dominicans are sent for these tasks. At this point, Dominicans were quite important also in the development of the feudal kingdoms, because they were used by the monarchs in opposition to counter the power of bishops. They had pretty strong political roles, also historiographically speaking, and so the Dominicans are sent to deal with the Scottish leaders on the Abbey Craig, but as the Chronicle of Gisborough writes, Wallace himself allegedly answered them, "Take back this reply, that we are not here to make peace, but to do battle to defend ourselves and liberate our kingdom. Let them come on, and we shall prove this in their very bears." Right. So this is interesting because the same Gisborough defines Wallace as a latro, basically as a thief, as a brigand, as a martyr. But it's still interesting that there is this very strong sense of Scottish interest and in the struggle against the English, and that is expressed by the leader. So the stage was set for battle, and the troops began to gather, also from the Scottish side, because the Scots, by the way, were had been observing the English movements. They had they were essentially waiting for their move, because they were the ones who were advancing, so they had just to wait. This is important to understand, because think about all the actual preparations that exist from one side or the other on the base of these differences. Like the English already knew that they would have had to cross the army to engage themselves into the battle. The Scots were waiting. There were obviously aware, awake, but still, they were preserving their strengths. So at this point, especially on the Scottish side, the commanders start gathering to counter the English moves that now were pretty clear to them. This is interesting because the Scottish army was still partly assembling, right? They weren't the solidly shaped expeditionary force the English had sent in. Scotland was more difficult to put together. All these thousands of infantry, especially, were gathering from all over, especially the lowlands, and they were continuing to arrive in part. So think also about the problems of discipline, of putting them together, and this is no joke. It's something very serious, also because they're lots of people and they have to be ordered well if you want them to be organized more properly. So in this sense, we have from the English side kind of a more professional organization. From the Scottish side, something that is kind of more difficult to manage, in which the commanders have a key importance because they are the ones who effectively direct the deployment. We have to lead these troops and to give them the cohesion that is necessary for the battle. So the Scots also started the source, and here it's interesting. Doesn't quite mention this process. It's simply, but we can imagine naturally that the Scots now were forming their infantry in this more or less traditional fashion that is known as the schiltrons or schiltrons. That were this sort of phalanx, basically. There's nothing strange about it. I mean, there were a formation that here, for the source of the battle, doesn't say how it was arranged. We normally, for subsequent battles, we know that the schiltron is something like a hedgehog, like kind of a circular in form. Here we are not really informed how it was conceived. I mean, the circular form is mostly for a defensive attitude. Now, as we will see, the Scots were instead advancing, and maintaining that formation in advance doesn't quite make a lot of sense, especially knowing that the English are coming only from one side, and what you have to do is to direct the infantry right on them. So when you look at medieval formations like this, in this case, you don't have to think there was anything standard. Even when you find kind of a characteristic tactical element like the schiltron would become famous for eventually especially during 14th century warfare. But the Scotland had this forms of this military this tradition of having this solid blocks of spearmen, pikemen, or if you want to define them, with this more or less effective defensive formation. But this is infantry in advance, and there is one side of the story is that I would like to make you understand the difficulties of making move 6,000 men, because they also do not have a collective discipline. To be honest, these were all freemen gathered from the region that didn't quite have any training for this larger formations to work. Right? They came from the various clans that they had an internal cohesion, but this could be on the base of tens, maybe even hundreds, but not in the range of thousands. And making them advance is something particularly complicated. So in defense, everybody can form this formation. I mean, it takes also in their leaders knowing how to appoint troops, etc. This is something. There is a segmentation in this in these ranks. The best armored, the better armored troops are in the front. They are the guys who have to take the heavier blows. They're usually the wealthiest, troopers that theoretically also have in this society for this reason a greater engagement in combat, or at least they are chosen among the most experienced also to be equipped in that way, because being in front line requires taking all of those blows. This happens all over ancient medieval history. Basically, the guys in the front are better armored than the guys in the back. Some of those who are in the back actually are even unarmored and unarmed in some ways. It may sound strange, but this is really how it works. Simply because at the point the enemy arrives at the posterior ranks, basically the wall formation is already annihilated, right? So the cohesion and the functionality of this formation is already deleted. But when you have massacred half of the troops from the front, and it will basically melt away. So the reason why you have to place all these troops behind is that they can form this, they can give more, let's say, some moral support. As infantry, they can't even push theoretically altogether, but this is not entirely necessary in this case, especially, it's a bit difficult to make all this. These are not really hoplitic phalanxes. You don't have this actual physical pressing from the posterior ranks towards the former ones, the forward ones, or at least you have them in less measure than others. And the hopeful thing you want as the commander is to keep naturally the discipline of these. I mean, to keep these troops, these formations solid, united. And this is a problem when they're going to advance. In this point in history, infantries are still haven't still broken out as this element that can defeat cavalry. They're starting to do it right now. Basically, for 2 centuries, medieval warfare had been dominated in open field by heavy cavalry, and there were some exceptions. There had been some exceptions especially at the outskirts of the feudal world, where naturally for political and social reasons, heavy cavalry was not the major element. And the dominating tactical element, let's say, in Scotland is an example of this, because it belongs to this fringe where, in fact, the land was too poor to afford feudalism, and therefore the solid base of heavily armored cavalry, and therefore this infantry had gained in some ways more or less power, but they hadn't been able at this point to defeat heavy cavalry in open field. The Battle of Dunbar is an example of that, just a year before, and it's really the normality. Right, all the myth, when you hear this stuff on the internet, people fail to recognize all the time there was a diachronic evolution of this in medieval warfare. You can't say that every single time you find a guy was, an infantryman was strongly determined to win, well, then you can beat cavalry. It has a lot to do with moral forces, but it's not all about it. There are all structural factors, and up to this point, up to the beginning of the 14th century, you do not find infantries winning on cavalries. And you will say, well, but Battle of Stirling Bridge is that, isn't it? No, it's not. And we'll see it now why. I explained before, it was a prelude to that development, but it's still not the proof of it, because the relations of force at this point were completely unbalanced, right? Given that the English had crossed the Forth with a very few troops, so basically all the Scots had to do was to run over them and to overwhelm them with numbers, right? So it doesn't actually tell us how that infantry would have performed if they had been, say, in open field against English cavalry, for that matter. what's the point in here is that, first of all, the Scottish army had been hastily assembled at this point, not just tactically but also strategically. So this means that there were several elements coming from everywhere. You had to basically glue them together in a decent form, and plus you had to maintain their order in an advance in maneuver that tends to mess things up. Infantries up to that point, coming back on the topic, were fundamentally just defensive in nature. I mean, there is evidence of infantry basically supporting cavalry while the cavalry battle was already started. But that is quite of a different thing. That's like more, infantry running after the cavalry from the behind and exploiting, those gaps that, filling those gaps that the cavalry had left open because maybe they were succumbing, etc., and trying to hit the other cavalry, but the enemy cavalry maybe just disemboweling the enemy horses, and this was typical. But this was not done by infantry in a regular form. Like, these were troops, some of the most courageous ones, probably equipped in a certain ways that had the kind of assault function. The problem is that while your own cavalry is still engaged, you cannot make infantry attacking en masse, or at least with all the bulk of your infantry that is orderly and should maintain that order. First of all, because you would basically eliminate space of maneuver for your own cavalry. That is not something that remains glued against the enemy formation as if combat lasted for without an end. Everybody who knows even like at least the ABC of warfare knows that combat is something that lasts only a pair of minutes at the longest, like on average. Medieval battles were so long during the day because these guys fought like for these formations came closer, they fought pretty hard for like 2 or 3 minutes, and then they disengaged, and like for half an hour they would still look at each other, and then they would go again. That's how it worked. So cavalry that also is more dynamic needs that space, needs that flexibility, that room for maneuvering, right? And if you put infantry behind them, and you gave them no space to retreat in, naturally there were corridors within the infantry formations, so that cavalry was there was enough room for make cavalry passing through the ranks. But let's say that you don't want the various ranks, the various formations to be too close, right? So especially the infantry existing at the time was not trained to advance, like what we see only from the 15th century, basically, with the Swiss infantry that eventually copied the remains, in the model of pikemen in the Renaissance warfare, is an infantry that can advance, right? In this time in history, instead, in the 13th but also in the 14th century, where infantry managed to defeat cavalry alone in open field, that is without the help of other cavalry, like it had been instead had happened in the case of this of these prodromes, let's say, did not advance, had a merely defensive function, and battles could be won at that point just in that way. One of the reasons is that these were not professional infantries. They didn't have the necessary training to advance and maintain the front cohesion, and this is it in a nutshell. That's really the problem, right? You need the first ranks, especially to remain united, to remain orderly. If you advance, if you have troops that come just from militias, like or peasantry, they don't have that type of training, right? And the best you can make them do is basically just to stand firm and steady in defense, fencing off cavalry attacks if that they're sufficiently well determined but not really advancing. So as we have seen, what the Scots have to do in here is to advance, and to advance fast, because if the English cross the 4th, and they deploy in a battle array that therefore, that remain, with all their full potential, well, that's a hell of a problem. So, but it's a problem at the same time because yeah, you have to attack the English while they're still divided by the 4th, but in which proportion? That's something that, because if you attack too early, basically they, you risk to cause too few losses, and at that point the English can wait for you, and the problem with the Scottish army was also to maintain its cohesion, right? We have seen that the English were kind of better organized, logistically speaking. The Scots had lots of problems. They had much more people, and especially they had a much less organized supplying system, and therefore keeping together all this mass of men was of dramatic difficulty, right? So big problems, really big problems, that had to make the Scots taking this opportunity, but also not risking to, let's say, killing too few Englishmen, and leaving still the large bulk of the English army from the other side intact. This would happen at the end of the day. It seemingly only 1/3 of the English crossed the 4th, but that was enough to, especially the vanguard, that had to be probably made up by the best troops, if anything, because they had to deploy frontally. So they were the ones who they had to have all the rest on their backs. Were enough, as we will see, for making the rest also of the English fleeing. So these are great problems. The Scots at this point are roughly, as we have said, 1,000 yards from the 4th. So this means that if you advance with a speed of 1 meter, 1.5 meters at a second, you will take basically 15 minutes to cross, to walk through this space and to reach the English, which is fairly few, right? And yet you don't want to lose formation. So probably the Scots advance at a speed that is sufficient to maintain their cohesion, right? Talking once again about the skill trends, at this point I don't think there is a reason to believe that the Scottish army was really arrayed in that fashion, that's with those circular formations. That is perfect in defense and will prove very hard for the English in defense in the future. But at this point there is no reason to form in that way. Why not? Because the skill trend is a merely defensive formation. You don't need to attack. You don't need to be deployed in a circle by attacking. Because by doing that, you're basically wasting like great part of your potential front by making a circle and not a frontal line, right? So the skill trend is made up also with the best troops on the outer side, and the weaker ones in the middle that try also to move around the internal perimeter according to where the enemy threat is coming from. So in fact, in the following battles, what you'll see is the English cavalry basically goes around the skill to spot where this is the weakest spot to charge into, and within them the Scots would move, trying to counter them in that place. But this is not the case. The Scots are advancing, and giving their superiority in numbers, it's also legitimate to believe that at that point order was important, but the main thing was to overwhelm the English with kind of an impetuous attack rather than a real order. Right, order was needed to move across the 1,000 yards, but once you arrived at contact with the English, you could really just charge, because that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to shatter them. Although, what we have from the Chronicle is particularly important. It says that the Scots sent the the lanciari, this is the term used in Latin, so the spearmen, at basically, just in front of the bridge. It doesn't specify which distance, but we know that part of the English army had already deployed. So basically, probably not just right in front of the opening of the bridge, but we will see later also certain aspects of this part of the story. In order to block their path, to impede their path, right? This term is interesting, lanciare, I mean in Latin, where you find it also for the Battle of Falkirk in the same chronicle. And I checked it out because if you come from a classical, let's say background, habit, you tend to think that lanciare is a term that, in fact, in the ancient world was used to define the javeliners more than the spearmen. So here, basically, the medieval chronicle uses the term lance to define what we would instead call, like, not just even a spear, but a pike, knowing what Scottish armies were about at this time. Naturally, we don't have to imagine any particular uniformity in this sense. I mean, it's not that every single Scotsman was equipped with pikes. Actually, probably, that was a narrow minority, but usually the pike was put in the front, right? And the other soldiers were like equipped usually with spears, but also with other pole arms or even axes and other blunt weapons, because especially these ones would be the ones that would come out of the Skiltrin to finish off the fallen enemy horsemen, and especially to smash hard against and to cause a trauma under the knight's armor, right? This is not the case. It will be the case in battles like Bannockburn, for example. And for what it takes, for what concerns Battle of Stirling Bridge, probably I really want to see this like more like the Scots overwhelmed the English with sheer numbers and even engaged tendentially also for a certain animosity and enmity and kind of clanic character in general, engaging with the English face to face. This is important, like not forming like the defensive formation and all, but really aggressing the English individually, almost. This is just an hypothesis, but I want to see it like this also, especially when the English ranks broke in the end, because part of the lack of discipline that we were looking at relatively to the Scottish army has to do with this more individualistic push, like the idea that these were, ideally still like, say, tribesmen. They wanted to challenge the enemy at the individual level, which is the worst in the sense that what makes really the difference is collective training. They had a few, right, and that was useful, especially during the march, to maintain the necessary cohesion to arrive at the enemy presenting this solid bulk of troops. But I think after that, it's not that you could really control these men, right? And this is particularly important in medieval warfare because you realize these troops were not trained. They didn't have a high discipline. They didn't regard that as the first thing. And it was arguably kind of a miracle even that such large numbers had managed to be fielded and to used so skillfully, like in this battle, right? So relatively to the array of the Scots during this event, we don't really know much. Counting 6,000 troops, it's possible that they were deployed in ranks of something like 1,000 in the front, and 6 in depth. That's fair. Maybe divided into 10 blocks of 600. But this is purely speculative. but that can be a thing. Always bear in mind that the space in here in width, it's not very long, and it's not very large to have such a broadened front, especially when you approach to the meander in which the English were developing. And this is interesting because if you look at the map, you realize that the Scots were coming down south, but their camp was, there is part of the fort still in a straight line that's that interferes with a straight line between the Scottish camp and the English army. So how really these troops moved is not known. I mean, it makes everything very asymmetrical, and even a formation very, necessarily inordered. I mean, I don't think that this army had, for example, the necessary training to wheel and to move, to remain perfectly shaped while, let's say, siding the fourth, moving kind of around it, and to swing with the right wing going faster, and the left wing kind of wheeling a bit on itself. So even if from the source we can't really tell that, it's possible, in my opinion, that this was like a big mass moving, not caring excessively about the internal cohesion that surely existed, but that we can think as not excessively marked in the first place. Consider, as we were saying before, that also the Scots had a relatively few time for deploying, right? So they didn't know essentially whether the English would have attacked or not. So probably the first movements of the morning had put them in alert. We know that the English started crossing at 11 a.m. So probably naturally everybody was woken up and ready to be deployed. But let's say that the thing was still in it was uncertain, and probably even massing all this big amount of troops was something pretty difficult from the Scottish side. And we can imagine at this point Wallace and Murray, kind of having looked at the scene at the distance with some relative perplexity, like why are the English coming back and forth initially? But then when they observe that the substantial numbers of the English troops are crossing, well, they have to put everything in motion. So basically, the Scots emerge now from the woods, and it's at this point that they form into their fighting formations. Now, this is important because it's not that they were concealed with the formation already arrayed, right? The Scots were concealed in these forests, in these hills, and now they form in the open. So it's also at this point that the English can assess the Scottish force in all its extension. So probably it's at this point that the English also start regretting about what the decision had been of attacking directly, because they realized that the Scots are freaking many, right? And both the Earl of Surrey and Cressingham had underestimated both the strength and fighting capabilities of the Scots, right? And probably they weren't that wrong in terms of quality, also because of what had happened at Dunbar the year before. But in terms of numbers now, and given that specific situation in which the English English army was split between, on two sides of the banks of the Forth, that things were getting pretty serious for them. So this disorganized rabble that Wallace and Murray had put together now were really now being employed in the right way, in a situation that evidently proves really of an English mistake rather than Scottish quality at this point. You will say, well, but the Scots eventually defeated the English. Yeah, but we have just said that the year before they had been embarrassingly defeated. At this point here, we can't really tell. Eventually, yes, it did happen, but armies also vary wildly in quality, in commitment. So it's not easy, even for someone who has been defeated so clamorously the year before to be willing to fight once again. You have to consider these moral aspects at the same time that are very, very important, especially when you have to attack, as a poorly equipped footman, some of the damn finest troops out there, armored, from foot to toe, and professionals of war, right? That's something important to bear in mind. And some even of the best knights that the English were fielding probably realized immediately that things were going seriously wrong. Yeah, and that was that must have been terrifying from the English side, because it was pretty evident what was going on. So at this point, there is a council of war in the English army, right? Because the thing appears to be very serious. So the Earl of Surrey calls his bannerates, they're essentially the officers of his army. These were noblemen that were entrusted, they were granted the command of a banner, which means these units that they were allowed basically to bear their ensigns and to have command of this large body of troops, and they were usually the most experienced troops. And there is the Scottish knight Richard Lundy that had joined the English army, that according to the Chronicle was apparently one of the very few men who assessed the situation correctly and basically suggested to take measure to counter the Scots in some way. So, quoting the Chronicle, he allegedly said, "My lords, if we cross the bridge, we are dead men, for we can only go over 2 by 2, and the enemy are already formed up. Their whole army can charge down upon us whenever they will." So he had understood what a point. So Lundy went on saying that not far above Stirling, the fort was fordable, 60 at a time, so pretty large, and therefore he asked the Earl of Surrey to give him a force of horsemen and foot, basically to go up there and to outflank the Scots, and falling on them in order to make them crumble. And this tactic is very, very sensible. It's part of those tactics that really were during the 13th century being pioneered in Europe. I mean, this idea of the attack from the flank, that for the chivalric ideal of the time, especially in the official accounts and in chivalric literature, was always considered as sort of cowardly tactic, right? But aside from the surface of this idealized courtly honor, we know that these tactics were used pretty extensively, and the same Earl of Surrey had actually experienced them back in the day, and it's therefore we can't let's say we can't think that the English command was inept at the point of saying, well, okay, we don't know what you're talking about, we don't want to do this. But probably there were certain internal hostilities that brought to this good proposal not to happen. Now, this is interesting that in a chronicle, the like the one of Walter of Gainsborough, the thing is actually stated, like, it's interesting because it recalls me of the battle I wrote about my master thesis that was actually telling the same thing. I mean, there is this council of war before that was actually just here it's 97. It was 20. It was actually 19 years before. So they're basically the same years in some ways, but those sources for my battle were instead very, let's say, very chivalrously oriented, and they saw this proposal as fundamentally as something that sparked resentment among the command, or better, those who were actually, the command was asking for these tactics to be carried out, and those who were entrusted with this were wavering because they thought that their honor would have been stained from it. Instead, if I'm not wrong, from this chronicle there is nothing like that. I mean, there is instead the positive presentation Walter of Gainsborough makes by saying, look, this guy was right, they should have done that. Now this is particularly interesting because it gives you a dimension also of the ethical perspective from the contemporary historiography, and this was actually a very good proposal because the English army was pretty large. I mean, at this point, the Earl of Surrey didn't quite didn't lack men. His main problem now was evidently that his men were crossing the bridge at a very slow pace, and therefore it would have taken forever in order to cross from the other side, on the other side, the wall, and with the wall force. So the very plausible possibility of fording the river in this area that could allow the crossing of 60 men at a time was a way to actually field more troops on the north bank of the Forth, and to actually make something sensible. This area, by the way, we don't really know which it was, because we have seen that it was, the geography has been changed a bit by men over the centuries, but it was this area a few miles north, in what is essentially today the tidal limit and the junction with the River Tythe flows into the Forth, right? Flowing into the Forth. So that was a pretty good reason. Also, pretty good proposal. Also, because it was fairly distant from the Scottish army. It could allow, therefore, sensible amount of troops to be deployed on another side, and at that point the Scots would have been in serious trouble, because, as we have seen before, they were moving probably like a very difficultly cohesed mass towards one single direction, right? This army was definitely not able to, let's say, change front and maintain its cohesion in the process. They didn't have the necessary training for performing that maneuver. So basically the English could have taken the Scots from the flank and caused a pretty heavy slaughter. Also, having this mile to pursue them and to butcher them down, given that they were mainly infantry. So this is a fairly good proposal that is interesting to have been recognized even by Walter of Gainsborough, and that was not carried out. And the reason why it was dismissed, it's seemingly because Cressingham disapproved it. So the treasurer basically had he was responsible for dismissing some troops in the campaign for reasons of expense, and he feared that at this point Cressingham was partly in charge of the whole management of the front from an economical point of view. So basically, Lundy's proposal was challenging even part of his management of the situation. So he was wishing this war to end quickly, and he didn't want someone else to take the merit for having won the battle without his own participation. Cressingham wanted naturally to rise also to the ranks, to become more powerful. So at that point, something very antipathetic, that is this contrast in the command that brings to a wrong decision on the base of personal rivalries, and for which eventually the English lost the battle. Right. So here the Chronicle says fundamentally that this was dismissed, and that the Earl of Surrey actually, that was the command-in-chief, agreed with Cressingham a decision, in opinion, and therefore a great opportunity was lost. So it says, let's not spend further the king's money, let's get it over with it, and instead, they lost much more evenly than that, and Cressingham especially personally. And so we know that the English army had, let's say roughly 1/3 of the English army had, both on foot and horse, had crossed the narrow bridge by 11 a.m. The Cressingham and the banners of the king and the earl to the fore. And this vanguard, as we've seen before, was something like 2,000 strong, with 100 horsemen and lots of infantry. Now, a word about this infantry. The English were bringing alongside with them lots of Welsh infantry that they had recruited as a consequence of the Welsh campaigns. So this was light infantry, not actually very different from the Scottish one, and they were cheap. They could be fielded very easily, and if properly used, they could be very effective, especially on this. On difficult grounds where but more or less this Celtic fringe. This Celtic fringe, the footmen were used to operate and to, but also as, let's call it line infantry. They could made this solid bulk of light spearmen that it's not really the best you can field, but it's still something that, especially against cavalry, can make something, right? The Welsh eventually will not be famous as the Scots for becoming, for being pikemen. Actually, there are sources say that basically the north of Wales was kind of more specialized in spears, in the south in longbow, but this is also relative. I'm not saying it's wrong, but there would be a lot to say about this also because of the prejudices that exist, because lots of people still believe that, for example, the English army developed longbow because of Welsh influence, which is absolutely false. There is absolutely no proof of this, nor that Welsh archers were better than English archers. This is something widely known. Just read Bradbury that already said it at the time. There is no evidence of any single kind that the English developed their longbows because of exposure to Welsh warfare. Like the English longbow existed already before. If at this point Welsh longbowmen and other infantry were used en masse in the English armies, it was a reason of, there were still, by the way, still way more English longbowmen at this point in English armies than Welsh ones, and were even paid more. So this is pretty eloquent, and believe me, this is widely known in historiography. I'm not inventing it, but everybody still thinks. I've heard some of also, relatively reliable YouTubers talk about this stuff as, still buying this. It's absolutely false. In any case, it's important because these are this Welsh foot are kind of light infantry, right? So you have this solid bulk of horsemen, probably are some of the finest of the English army, and then lots and lots of this light infantry that passes, right? And I would say maybe we'll say it later, some consideration. Let's say, let's think of something, because unfortunately, we don't know what the Scottish cavalry did in this battle, because we know that there was some of it, and probably chances are that it was left in reserve to just counter enemy movements, also because probably the Scots knew, for example, about that fording that Lundy knew about. Also, Lundy was a Scotsman himself, so they feared probably that this flank attacks, and it's plausible that in that context, really, Scottish cavalry didn't quite join the front, right, and was left in reserve. That is kind of a sensible choice, because especially if you're throwing all that mass of infantry against the enemy, you don't want to hinder them. As we've said before, it's useless to press cavalry and infantry all together. You cause only disorder and mess. So it was clever to say, okay, if you really have to defeat the English, excuse me, at this point, let's send this mass of infantry, and in case things go wrong, as cavalry, we can still go away, run away, or at least we can maybe cover assaults on the flanks because otherwise you would have remained bottled up, right? And there is fairly no reason for that. It's kind of a sensible choice, right? Because even if the let's say the English cavalry that had crossed the fort at this point was probably inferior in numbers to the Scottish one, on average, English cavalry was better than Scottish cavalry at this point. They were, on average, heavier. And in any case, even if they had broken the enemy cavalry, because that's the concept of how warfare was usually waged, if this had been a pitched battle, let's assume, the normal thing would have been, for the Scots in this case, probably to assume a very, strong defensive position, which the infantry would probably have to work in order to stem enemy cavalry. But as long as you have cavalry, theory is that they should meet in the vanguard and clashing them, and then in this case maybe not, because English cavalry was probably overwhelmingly superior in number and in quality to the Scottish one, surely in number. And the concept is, at that point you don't even meet in open ground, right? That kind of makes sense. So that's also why this battle, for example, took place, because the ground here was particularly favorable for the Scots. Like, in general, there is a river in the middle. There is this kind of difficult ground all around. That's perfect to defend, right? So it was obvious for the Scots to behave in this way. But as I was saying before, just imagine if the Scottish cavalry had gone in front of the Scottish infantry in this case. They might have had defeated, theoretically, the English cavalry, but then they would have had to deal with the Welsh spearmen. It's not really what you want to do. Hopefully, you just send this mass. There is a solid 3-2-1 at this point. Like, we've seen that the English have crossed in 2,000. Only Scottish infantry is 6,000, right? We don't know what cavalry is doing in the Scottish army. We don't know what archers are doing, but probably they're harassing the English at this point. It's unfortunately that we don't really know, but it's still just imagine from the English side what the situation is. You see that the enemy are vastly superior in number. You have crossed, so the majority of your fellow comrades are from the other side of the bridge so far, and that doesn't help psychologically speaking. Then you see you have no escape, if not into the river, which is fine, especially for if you're lightly equipped, but not if you're a heavy knight in that case. You have to kind of hurry up in deploying, because the enemy can assault you from a moment to another, and plus you are targeted with arrows. That's not really a very good situation for your own morale, and plus you have in fact the enemy that is 3-1 that is attacking you. 3-1 is basically the minimum safety for a direct attack on the enemy. Like, that 3-1 you can solidly do something about it. Although in here, as we said before, the thing is probably more complicated, and it's a pity that we don't know much, and it's complicated because of the nature of the ground. As we were saying before, the Scots do not have a straight line of land that connects them with the English. They have to kind of pass along the curves of the fort, so that this wall formation has problems probably to move in the process. So there is a part of the Scottish army that is advancing in fairly well in a straight line, but they kind of the rest of the army cannot follow without making the whole army wheeling, or without really making one pass before then the other, and therefore breaking the unity of the formation. So, in my opinion, as I was saying before, at this point probably the Scottish attack was less coordinated than when we think. It was pretty messy to get through that in the first place. And here really the Scottish command has proved to be effective yet. Like, at this point we've seen it's difficult to coordinate the whole thing. Your troops are pretty uncoordinated rebel. So what you have to invest prevalently in is timing, right? So at this point, as we've said before, it was a problem. Attacking the English when? Because if you really wanted to defeat them, it was pretty damn good option. Like, it happens relatively rarely to find an enemy that really makes such evident mistake. But as we've seen, there were also difficulties from the Scottish side to coordinate the whole thing. And still, the English had the best quality, especially cavalry could really put up a ferocious resistance. So what do you have to do? Do you want to kill a few of them, but with a certain degree of certainty, or more of them, but with a much greater danger, right? So you want to wait how much? So we don't know how it happened, right? We can just speculate. In any case, given the outcome of the battle, it's very likely that Wallace and Moray made the right calculation. So probably there was a debate. Like, we can imagine the Scottish headquarters being composed by the two leaders, but also the various officers, clan leaders that had their own say in the process, and judgment prevailed eventually. So definitely it was a difficulty also in this context to come to a unanimous answer, but given what the answer was at the end, we can think that the ultimate decision was the right one, was the correct one, or at least the one that ensured victory for this cause. So the Scottish infantry began to advance. Obviously, we can imagine at this point, there is this sense of non-coming back in certain moments, like military history like this. You don't know how it's going to be. Everything can go wrong, theoretically. If you had to make a projection of that, it can be disastrous. So you can imagine the leaders watching very carefully all the movements of the army, the officers and the NCOs from the field, shouting at their men to maintain the position, to check their advance, to try to contain those who were going astray from the formation, keeping them together, and also not to make them freak out. So there is a lot of adrenaline, a lot of tension, people feeling sick that you're going to fight in there. And you can imagine also from the English side, pretty what the feeling could be. And especially from the English side, think about the mass of these troops that are advancing against you. Look at the lances, especially the ones that they can see in the front rank of the troops that are, more heavily armored and better equipped in general. And still looking at, a longbow shot flying here and there, that's not really nice. Wounding and creating more chaos and tension rising, right? And there is also probably this tension inherent to the social differences, tactical differences between cavalry and infantry. It's very likely that the English have crossed first with cavalry, so that they're nervous about this Welsh infantry deploying at that point, after them and telling them to hurry up, and also kind of signaling to hurry up from the other side to the other side of the fort. And there's also an acoustic dimension of the situation. Think about all the shouts, the concited tones, and think about even 6,000 infantry on the march, like rumbling, and this sound approaching, like a thunderstorm, and that's something that really overloads you with tension in a situation where you should be as cold-blooded and as you can. So after the Scots have crossed this 1,000 yards, they enter in contact with the enemy. So we can imagine this pretty ferocious and intense fight that starts in the first lines, and this is we have just speculation, because the Chronicle doesn't really tell what goes on. Right, it doesn't tell much about the combat. It simply says that the English basically are routed, and there is eventually, that's how he puts the thing in the sequence. And basically, the exploit of some English are narrated when during the rout. But there has surely been some combat going on, and I believe before the Scots took all the repelled the English, that there had been someone, like in all battles, that had resisted till to the last. Probably some of the cavalry, but possibly also some of the infantry, and the English at this point were pretty in great trouble, because there were definitely other troops crossing the bridge. Part of their formation was still that eventually not formed, so they were probably not in the best situation. they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. And here it's when we have to probably realize that the English, where were they developing really in the meander of formed by the fort, right? Because if you look at the position of where the bridge was, chances are that it you know, the English had deployed really in a you know, if you look at the meander on the map, the bridge is basically put on the left, right? And this was even further at the time compared to the old bridge that exists today. So this is speculation, but let's say it's possible that the English had deployed, let's say, at the not really in front of the directly in front of the bridge, but let's say forming a line on the narrowing of the land by the river, right? So this narrowing that is ideal to cover, because in this sense you should not be outflanked. But the problem is that this is shifted from, you know, in its axis from the bridge in itself. So this means that it's possible, also from as we will see from what the Chronicle tells in part, that the English were either withdrawing or developing, at a certain point losing contact with the bridge itself, and that the Scots basically closed it, and therefore in closing the English troops in the meander. Now this is pure speculation. I don't want to say it happened, but it's possible, and we know that there were some English that had to fight through the Scottish lines in order to cross, I mean to reach the bridge, right? Again, I mean, some of them tried to escape into the river, but it's obvious that many of the cavalry knew that they would have drowned as it happened, by the way, so that they were trying to, I mean, you know, between the two death options, you know, let's say the best one was to fight through the Scots, and to get back to the bridge, and therefore on foot and without swimming through the river, and this was a problem, by the way, especially at the beginning, because the bridge was packed with troops, right? And we know that you know, that's complicated, you know, because there is someone who wants to go further, there's someone who's already retreating, so it's a pretty mess, and everything into a pretty massive onslaught. So, by the way, the idea of the Scots fighting through, of the English fighting through the Scots, especially if you consider the heavy, you know, the heavily armored knights, makes you understand a lot, because at this point, you know, as we've said, the Scots were mostly lightly equipped, like they were light infantry in their regard as well, despite their front line was probably made up by the best armored. So, however, the English knight was more heavily armored, which means that you can, you know, at the time, it's not that there are guns, you can take down people so easily. In order to actually kill someone who is protected by mail and even parts of plate armor that is developing at the time, it's pretty damn difficult. You have basically to put that person down physically and then to try to stab them with a stock or something in the junctures of the armor. And it takes a lot of time. It's difficult to kill a person easily and quickly that way. And we know that, in fact, the nobility, like the knights in general, were equipped and used in general to be equipped with weapons that were designed to chop through unarmored troops. For example, the falchion, that is usually regarded as a sort of peasant weapon or militia weapon, actually was largely used even by knights, simply because they could get in through these crowds of lightly equipped troops, as the majority of troops were at the time, without fearing much from them, because they didn't have the lightly armored trooper tends not to approach into hand-to-hand combat. That's why also pole arms, to keep the enemy at distance, are so favored by these troops. And in the mess that is happening here, naturally, even we can imagine that the frontal pikes maybe have partly either broken, or that there have been some gaps have been formed into the Scottish front line. Also because probably the English charged. The English cavalry charged into it. At a certain point, they dismount because they realize also that the spaces are becoming dramatically narrow, and they have to do it. Also, especially if they want to defend, because the cavalry probably initially charged because they had enough room. Then, when you don't have enough room to charge, it's useless. Cavalry cannot defend by definition, so you have to dismount and to fight on foot. And you can imagine probably these knights getting through the Scots, butchering them down, trying to literally make a way through them, but also falling into the process because they're overwhelmed by the numbers as well. And at this point, the Earl of Surrey is, by the way, is safely on the right bank of the fort. So he didn't risk. He eventually survived the battle. As we've seen, he died several years later. But there were lots of people from the other side, and that now we will see, including Cunningham, by the way. And so at this point, you can imagine, especially from the English side, the least disciplined troops like the Welsh infantry saying, "You know what? I'm out of here," and especially the Welsh, who were largely unarmored, would throw themselves into the fort to swim it through. Many knights probably tried to cross it, but with their cumbersome armor, many drowned, and it was normal. But we know from the Chronicle of Gainsborough that at least one knight and his horse with great difficulty managed to swim the river fully armored. Right? Yeah, that's pretty interesting as well. So because the problem with you can imagine the difficulties of crossing a river armored, but it's also like you can imagine what a riverbed is like. It's full of I don't know about the fort in that space, but it's not an even surface, so you can fall into dumps, or you can say, okay, well, here maybe I can't cross, and then you don't know that the water is deeper than you imagine. So this happened all the times in many battles where this situation was. In fact, some of the greater slaughters in warfare, if you look at medieval warfare, also happened exactly because of this. Not much because troops were butchered down, but because there was a river close. Butchered down the combat, but because there was a river close, and then the heavier troops, but also other lighter troops, crossed, and maybe they didn't know how to swim. Considered many people at the time did not know how to swim, so that's also kind of and all of this in a pretty dreadful situation in which you're already, exhausted, traumatized. And many people even maybe dying of, I don't know, heart attacks or stuff like that. Also because in Scotland, maybe on September the 11th, it's not that warm either. So maybe you were so hot because of all the all the effort, the fear, etc. You throw yourself into the waters that are fresh, if not cold, and you get a stroke or something. that happened as well, but think about the tension of these moments. And I think the Chronicle says that 300 Welsh infantrymen managed to get across the river. But I don't remember what it was the Chronicle says. And at this point, there were also in the English army some garrison troops of Stirling Castle, right? And many of them they had participated they had crossed and they perished in this disaster. Now, Cressingham, as we were saying before, had crossed as well, so he was considered a fighter, but because of his overweight, he was taken, and he was massacred by the Scots, who hated his guts, and basically he was scorched, and the Scots eventually simply shared his own skin among them. So yeah, these are the gentle things that happen in history, among the various other things. And there is instead the Marmaduke the Twanged. There was this Yorkshire knight that instead becomes kind of in Gainsborough Chronicle the bit of the hero of the situation. For this reason, we think that Walter of Gisborough maybe knew Marmaduke. Anyhow, he proved to be this redoubtable warrior, right? And at this point, he was at this point much of, you can imagine the mess of the battle, and Marmaduke looked at the banners of the king and the earl falling beneath the spears of the Scots. So that is not a good moment, because when the flags fall, it means it's over. Like, flags in battle are dramatically important, because the battles are terribly chaotic. So that's the only point of reference that you usually have, especially in open ground where maybe there are no trees or no specific, no particular sign you can rally around. So the idea is that when a flag falls, basically you do not know where to go. Naturally, you can look around if visibility is fine, if there is not too much dust in the air, and kind of still knowing where you are. But let's say that the flag bearer is also someone pretty tough that remains at the core formation, or at least, or in the front. So if he falls, that's a situation that basically from which you can tell that unit is suffering pretty harshly, right? Naturally, someone else can take the flag, but if it falls definitely, and there are Scots all around, you can probably realize it's over. So Marmaduke realized that everything was lost. He rallied his horsemen, and at this point, that's where he decides not to risk to drown by attempting to swim the Forth, and he led his men through the enveloping ranks of the Scots across their rear towards the bridge, right? So from this detail, we can assume that part of the English army from the left bank of the Forth had been cut out from the bridge, and so there were Scots in the middle, and the English had to get through them. So we don't know how it happened. At this point, Marmaduke and his men were still on horseback, right? So they were part of, by the way, some of the finest troops. They were heavily armored, so they managed to form this bloody pathway through the Scottish ranks with their charge, right? And this is a dramatic moment in which some English knights do not make it. the same Marmaduke's nephew was very young, was brought down by the Scots, and he was down his horse, and he was crying for help, and the Scots instead surround him and butcher him. And you can imagine what it means, I mean, to see your nephew shouting for help, thinking all the pride, all the, the fact of being, a noble, having this, in this terrible mess, and to watch the horror of someone being massacred in front of your eyes, someone you should be, you weren't probably entrusted to look after, and that must have been terrible. And he, in fact, Marmaduke at this point dismounts and trying to help, but it's too late, so he mounts once again on horseback, and he manages in this mess to reach the bridge once again. He manages to ride to safety, right? And it seems at this point that after Marmaduke's retreat across the bridge, basically the English resistance was over. This is particularly interesting because it proves that there is always this last, usually in these battles during the rout, there is always this last elite element, sometimes composed by, in fact, the finest troops, even the commander's troops that exist, to let the other troops flee in time. And these were heavily armored knights that managed to reach you, and probably we don't really know whether someone else was left there for sure, by the way, but in fact we know the English suffered pretty extensive losses, and it's possible that many of them happened also after this elite unit had fled the battlefield. And that's important because when you see that the elite runs away, well, there's not much you can do, especially in that situation where the enemy is so overwhelmingly superior in numbers. So at this point the Scots win because the Earl of Surrey retreats, and it's over. Like the rest of the English army, those 2/3 of the entire force, retreat as well. And in the process, the Earl of Surrey orders, by the way, the bridge to be cut off, so that they could retreat more easily, and eventually we'll see that. In the meanwhile, the Scots have taken the field, as we were saying before. The Cunningham's corpse is flayed and divided in pieces of his skin, and that were shared among this, the Scots, and who hated this man. And the chronicle states of the many who were deceived that day, he was the most deceived. He who was slippery, haughty, proud, and addicted to greed. Right? So there is this pretty, negative judgment given by Gisborough. And so Andrew Murray, from the Scottish side, was mortally wounded, as we said before. For the rest, I don't think we have news even of Scottish losses, but presumably, there had been some sufferance, but the English had taken the most of the losses. And yeah, this is pretty much it. So since we said that we're not going to analyze the strategic background of the situation, I would say we stop here. Stirling Bridge at this point was left by the Earl of Surrey, who organized this a resistance into the castle. The castle was pretty sound structure already at the time, although different from the one obviously we see today. And it was left in command of Marmaduke the Twang, and also William Fitzwarren, that resisted, and while the Earl of Surrey basically went away, promising some relieving force, because now basically they were leaving Stirling Bridge to be besieged by the Scots, and albeit some reinforcement arrived, that was not enough for like the major army that, the major contingent that the Earl had promised. So eventually the castle fell. Marmaduke was taken prisoner and eventually exchanged in April 1299, after more than a year as a prisoner. And yeah, so yeah, just for talking about the major characters and their story in the process. So, having said this was really the battle as it is, and unfortunately we don't know more. So what can we learn from this battle? I mean, we've seen that it's fairly simple, but also fairly interesting. Well, I think we have explained enough let's say the importance of the maneuver in here, and that's I think how we have to contextualize a bit the battle in itself, because many people would say, well, this was a Scottish victory, so basically we can compare it, for example, to like Bannockburn, this major Scottish victories against English cavalry at the hand of the Scottish infantry. Well, this is not really correct. I mean, in order to assert something like that, you should be able to assess what the real force of Scottish infantry really was versus the English cavalry, but the army in general. And this is very difficult to do in this specific context. When you perfectly understand that the battle was won basically for a mistake of the English and not because of a particular ability of the Scots. Definitely the Scottish commanders, Wallace and Murray, were pretty good at doing what they did. I mean, it took a lot of skill, but that's a skill of command. It doesn't tell you whether the Scottish army here was kind of an equal ground superior to the English one, or that this proves that it was a victory of infantry over cavalry, right? It's like you're going too far if you've seen like this, because there is no evidence, there is no proof. We don't actually know what the ratio of forces really was. It's likely that if these two armies had met in open ground, the English would have gotten the better of it, like it had happened at Dunbar, right? And this is not to say, okay, well, why do you say probably? Well, probably because it had already happened, and because the same English assessed the Scottish force not to be so much, which doesn't mean they couldn't do a mistake, but essentially the same caution with which the Scots handled the whole situation was evidently a proof in some way that they knew that potentially the English could sting at best, even in that in that corner in which they had trapped themselves in after the crossing of Stirling Bridge, right? It's also, so what does this mean? It means practically that we have no way to say that here the infantry, Scottish infantry, had the necessary strength to beat English cavalry yet. And that's why when we study the impressive series of infantry victories of the first half of the 14th century, we start in fact with the Battle of Courtrai, or Courtrai, if I understood correctly, in 1302. And when we look at these other battles, we we say, okay, yes, this may be a prodrome of that, because we know that also, the Scots earned, are part of those victories on the first half of the 14th century with their infantry against cavalry, but they're not quite that. And in fact, even some, let's say, alleged infantry victories of the first half of the 14th century were not quite infantry victories in the sense we don't really know. For example, Swiss infantry, right, that will become enormously famous in the mid-15th century because it was something very different from the thing that it was in the early 14th century. In the early 14th century, it did achieve some victories, but if you analyze the battle, and this is what De Vries explains quite clearly, you realize that they owe their victory more to the fact that, let's say, to terrain, or because they ambushed the Habsburgs, not really because their infantry in open ground would have been able necessarily to win over heavy cavalry, right? And this is particularly interesting because this series of victories, like 20 victories in this 50 years, at a certain point stop. Like with 1348, they stop. And maybe many of you will say, well, but what about the English armies of the 100 Years' War? That is an exception that confirms the rule, I would say, because those were armies that weren't really spontaneously rising like the one of the Scots, or the one of the Flemish, or the one of the Swiss, or the one of the German Dietmarschen, for example. The English armies were directed by the king. Like it was the same, with Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III. There is all this development that brings the English crown to require that huge amount of longbowmen coupled with men-at-arms that also in here are often forgotten, and let's say it is a combined arm effectively. And also the fact that they fought on foot is in some ways kind of I wouldn't say simply accidental, but you have also taken into consideration that the great victories, the English victories of the 100 Years' War, were in a context where the English were outnumbered, and heavily outnumbered, and that brings as a necessary consequence that you have to dismount, a bit like Marmaduke or other knights in this battle at one point, because they wanted to intervene, but this is different. But the concept is that cavalry cannot defend. By definition, the arm of cavalry does not defend. You need to dismount in order to defend. Cavalry has an eminently offensive capability, not a defensive capability. So if you're widely outnumbered, your intrinsic advantage has to emerge from defensive position, right? That, remember, when we study von Clausewitz, that defense is the stronger form of war, right? And therefore they dismount, but English armies were all mounted, like men-at-arms were mounted, were horsemen. They were knights, mounted knights. Even the horse archers, the longbowmen were actually horse archers in many chances. So what happens with English armies is an exception, is directed by the crown, it's not spontaneous, it's something that affirms itself as a sort of doctrine, say very anachronistically speaking as a term, and it's a special path on its own, right? But with all the other victories, you see that they stop in the mid-14th century. So before the rise of Swiss infantries, basically you don't have this infantries that alone can win against cavalry. This is very important. I promise I will make tons of other videos on this topic because that's what I'm kind of interested in and better documented in. Definitely the Battle of Stirling Bridge, from this point of view, is still very meaningful because it is true that it's a prodrome, right? You have effectively infantry doing most of the job from the Scottish side, but against an enemy that is dramatically inferior in numbers. So what do we get from it? That the Scots had an easy victory? Not really, because also in here we have seen that probably it was very difficult to put all those troops together, to make them work and to give the right timing. But it doesn't we cannot assess that it was an infantry victory, because the infantry victory entails that infantry has to meet cavalry in open ground and to defeat it, and the Scots will make it, but on another occasion, right? So this is particularly important. On another level, this battle exemplifies brilliantly the importance of correct maneuvering, right? So at least from what we know from from Walter of Gisborough, the English screwed up. I mean, they really made a pretty bad mistake, and they did it allegedly for rivalries within the command. And it's also very interesting because the English here are replicating they're trying to replicate a tactic that now by the end of the 13th century has become pretty well known all over Western Europe. I mean, all over Europe, telling the truth. Like in the East, it was somehow already well known, but at this point had spread solidly also among the the Western, let's say, the feudal cavalry of Western Europe. That is the one of making flank attacks, carrying out flank attacks against the enemy, and the option seemingly was possible, and it was discarded for whichever reason. We don't know whether the chronicle is correct or not, but it kind of makes sense that it does happen, that mistakes are done. The only thing you can wonder is why the hell the English, threw themselves into the... I mean, once they had acknowledged that the Scots were more than what they expected, and that their situation, that the English situation was pretty desperate, why didn't they change their plans? Simply rivalry? What I would like to put we don't know, obviously, but that's where I would like to put the accent on, because here we basically rely only on one source. I mean, this was a it was a major battle of the Scottish Wars of Independence, and it was important because it was a Scottish victory, particularly. So the question though is, this is an encounter in which lots of men died. By the way, we didn't talk about the losses, but let's say that we can assess the English losses to 1,000 something, or especially among infantry, and probably 100 knights, between killed or drowned, right? From the Scottish side, we don't really know, as we were saying before, but we don't necessarily have to think that they were so low, right? And that would be very interesting to know, because if we had a measure of how the Scottish losses had been, everything would have been fairly easier to assess in some way, and probably you could reinforce more the case that maybe it was an infantry victory or not, or at least it was something where the infantry had its own solid let's say importance as a tactical factor. But what I would like to make you reflect on is that we are really depending on one single source, which means that if that source, that seems to be a reliable one, a well-informed one, and that tells the story very pleasantly. I liked very much Walter of Gisborough, because it's very clean. I mean, if you read it in Latin, it's very, very intelligent. He was an intelligent person. He writes very well. He is conceptually clear. So he was telling a story that he knew, or at least that he knew how to tell well and plausibly. But that's basically the only thing we have, and this thing happened 600 years ago. Like, how do we know? Right? The concept is 700 years ago. But the concept is what, how can we know? This is the real problem of history. Like, we have that source, okay, but can we trust it? The question is not, no, we shouldn't trust it, because, we should always be skeptical. The problem is that we don't have any other proof of that. And it's dramatically evident how when you have multiple sources, especially of this time, how they all, they rarely tell the story in the same way. As I was saying before, in my master thesis, I studied this battle. It's pretty close to this one in time. And I had something like 40 sources, and of course just like 10 of them said something actually meaningful about the development of the battle. But if you study 10 sources and you realize that there are like 3 that say one thing and other 3 that say the exact opposite, you say, but then what the hell can we know? I am personally, I must say, and I don't know whether I trust too much, but I think that Walter of Gisborough was pretty accurate. Like, I'm convinced that he was accurate, but at the same time we should be skeptical enough. Like, we don't know, maybe he hated Cunningham and he wanted to put this story that he was just a fat, greedy bastard that only cared about his own wealth and power, and then gave this bad advice. What if it wasn't true? What if, he actually maybe was the one who tried to make the sensible choice? This fact that there is the Scottish knight that says, I know that there is a fording there, we can use it. It's also plausible, kind of makes sense. And it kind of makes sense, for example, this being a Scotsman wasn't very, maybe, I don't know, there was some additional contempt. Cunningham was said to have kind of hated Scotland, or disliked it. It might have been also this kind of national rivalry. Why not? But these are only hypotheses and based just on an account that was written 700 years ago, and that's all we have about something that happened and about which we don't know anything else. I would like to stress this fact. Just think about, in the line of history, how this thing has been handed down to us and how much we can really know. Right? However, the Chronicle tells the story with a certain military logic as well. Right? It's very simple. What it surprises me when I read it, it relatively surprises me, is that he's fairly rich in details, and yet, basically, it doesn't tell much about the actual fight. Probably because there wasn't effectively much of it, but given the detail, also the story of Marmaduke during the rout and all, he simply says, the Scots descended against the English, and the English broke. That's literally it. And, it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, it's as if he concentrated more on certain aspects and kind of didn't care about others, right? But it's normal, because every source does that. And we all do in some measure. Okay, what else can I say about this battle? Well, of course, we don't know much about the role, for example, of Scottish cavalry and of longbowmen from both sides. But we can imagine they were regularly employed, because these battles were... archers were meant to do exactly that. You have to imagine a medieval battle like with darts flying all the time, like an ancient battle where there were crossbow bolts or javelins as well, so it's possible. What I would like to stress is also that probably the Scots were attacking in a much more disordered yet aggressive way. They gained a momentum probably when they charged the English. And I want to believe it is the case. What is interesting is that when the Chronicle says that Marmaduke's men were able to launch a charge into the Scottish ranks, that tells you that I should maybe reread the source, telling the truth, because I'm not sure whether he puts it exactly in these terms. Let me see. I can find the page now. Okay, Stirling, let me see. I can't find it, but whatever. But I wanted to say in general is that probably we don't have to consider the Scots as this solidly packed, stereotypically packed formation of the Skiltron. and not the formation in the first place. These were probably much more scattered troops, because one thing is defending, and then you put all the pikes in the front. Probably all the pikes were put in the front here too, but the fact that Marmaduke could charge, for example, through them and pass through them tells you that probably also the Scots had lost part of the cohesion. And actually, if that detail is true, it means that actually English cavalry could get through a Scottish, the Scottish infantry in general, right? And my idea is that, I don't know, I have this prejudice by reading the source, I don't know why, but looking at the battlefield and its morphology more than else, that the Scots had kind of attacked en masse, relatively without order. Even if the Chronicle says that the Scots sent the spearmen to block the passage in the front, and surely there was a solid front, but I suspect that the thing, especially during combat, evolved in a much more disorderly and brutal way, in which that Marmaduke's cavalry could simply get through the Scots, even if they were, if the English were so inferior in number at this point, and even more the elite cavalry. And obviously, also in here, you have to think we are relying just on what the Chronicle says. So, was it true? Was it false? Maybe Marmaduke was Walter's friend. We don't know. We don't know. But it's meaningful that it's said, because it's still one of the only evidence we can base ourselves on, and that tells that basically this English cavalry has the ability of getting through Scottish infantry, its commander even dismounting and mounting once again. It's not a few, right? So there is a progressivity in this battle. There is naturally the young nephew that is butchered down, is overthrown. And there is so much that evidently escapes our understanding, but the whole battle kind of makes a lot of sense, right? This is a battle that really is explained by itself. There are lots of battles that to which we don't really know what happened, even in the general, not in the detail. The Battle of Stirling Bridge is actually, on the only evidence we have, it's pretty logical. Like, we can't understand perfectly what happened here. It kind of perfectly makes sense. We can lack knowledge about single units that were detached, like the Scottish cavalry, and we don't know how even the English developed across the bridge. But we know pretty clearly what the positions were, so we can be fairly sure where it happened, how it happened, and the conclusion, the narrative makes perfect sense, even from a strictly military logic point of view. It does make sense. So this is a battle in which you can see so much the importance of maneuvering, and the importance of, even the fog of war, because the fog of war in this sense had made the English thinking, when they decided to cross the fort, they didn't know much about the Scots in the first place. They knew the army was there. They probably saw the smoke and the lights and all, but the Scots were concealed in the forests there, so they thought probably they were less, but also probably they didn't give damn about their military quality, and who knows where they were right in terms of strictly of quality at that point. However, the Scottish command was pretty capable, and it's also interesting, by the way, that this is also a detail, that Murray was mortally wounded. Now, if he was actually the commander-in-chief together with Wallace, which we don't truly know, because we don't know what, we know that these were the two military leaders, but we don't know in which relation they were in the chain of command. But it's very interesting that Murray participated even on the front of the battle. And I would like to stress that, given a look to the battle, you realize that there is not an enormous space for 5,000 men in there. for 6,000 men in that meander of the river. So the concept is that however stretched or concentrated the Scottish troops were, still Murray was in the thick of the melee, right? And he was killed, or at least he died of his wounds afterwards. Which, by the way, I don't know, might have happened. Let's say maybe an English longbowman hit him on the distance, and his wound was rotten after some time, and he died after that. We don't know. But the fact that a commander dies, especially commanders at this point, you can imagine they were pretty heavily armored. Like this makes sense all the time. It was a part of the military ethos of the time to risk life as a commander, like it was expected, because this was a very solidly chivalric world to which even kings, like think about Edward I. It's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, fighter, individually speaking, of English in the history of English monarchs. This was a moment in which the feudal and chivalric military ethos permeated a bit everyone. And even the Scots, as we've seen, they weren't particularly feudalized, but they had this very strong pride in forms of the chieftains, of these leaders of men, right? For which Murray had probably to go into the front, but having died, he probably exposed himself very much, even though probably he was equipped with the finest armor, like all commanders at that point would. We know nothing about Wallace in this context, but we don't know. However, it's pretty unlikely that they both fought that they abandoned command. I explain myself better because the options are two, and they are important in their implications. So first of all, okay, let's go by hypothesis of an hypothesis. Let's assume that Murray was in the front line, right, and he fought in first ranks, and he was mortally wounded. Okay, so Wallace, so he evidently, he could lead from the front, but at that point, for the reasons we have mentioned above, probably there was not much to command. There was more to incite and to say, okay, run, go against them, something like that, than actually maneuvering, because those 6,000 Scottish infantry were not things to maneuver. There was only 6,000 to spur, to assault the English in hand-to-hand combat. But so in this sense, we don't know where Wallace was, and maybe the presence of both commanders was necessary in the front. Who knows? But if it is so, if this is the case, then it means, and even if it had been only one of them, it means that there was a very strong commitment from the Scottish side to mean what? That this was not a joke, this was not a simple walk. They evidently feared that the Scottish phalanx could break, that the English were still dangerous, even if they were overwhelmed 3-1 numerically speaking. So this could actually speak for the relatively poor quality of the Scottish army. Otherwise, we can think maybe Wallace was somewhere else. Maybe they had even remained up to the hills. We don't know. Into Abbey Craig or somewhere else. By the way, that's incidentally where today there is the National Wallace Monument. And those heights, those hills, to not really to direct the battle, but to say things like, if we have to lose, maybe let's let one of us to remain alive to be a commander, and we have no knowledge. Maybe, who knows, maybe Wallace was together with the Scottish Cavalry in reserve somewhere else, ready to to intervene, which would make sense, because why putting both leaders in the front of the army without controlling the reserves? Like, you need a chain of command, someone who is above. So this may be however, it reflects a kind of a skillful management of the situation. Like, you want one commander that goes to the front together with the infantry, that is this rebel that you don't fully trust, even though they might have had all their reasons to hate, to loathe the English. But maybe they needed to see their chief in the front together with them. And then you have to direct the plausible reserves into it, but maybe we don't know. Maybe the cavalry was still somewhere close. We don't know. This is the problem. We don't really know. But nevertheless, it's interesting. And sad also that naturally that Murray died in that fashion. From the English side, as we've seen, the Earl of Surrey didn't participate to fight, and that also kind of makes sense because he was commander-in-chief. He probably wanted to look the thing from the distance. Cunningham participated in there, so it's also meaningful because and this is meaningful also because he was the one who had been responsible, according to Gisborough Chronicle, for that tactical choice. So maybe the Earl of Surrey had been convinced by him, but said, okay, you wanted this, now you go there, and you take your own responsibility for it, because it's I personally believe that the Earl of Surrey, if he was really advised by Lundy, or by anyone else for that matter, to send that detachment upstream to the fort, and he refused, he made that choice, but maybe not to go against Cunningham. Cunningham was a kind of a powerful man in his own regard, but said, okay, you wanted this, so you go there. In fact, Cunningham died. It was killed in an awful way. So it's this is the set of considerations that are just hypotheses and nothing else, but they can help to understand better the battle. For the rest, I don't see any other particular... I mean, from a strictly tactical point of view, I don't see anything particular that we can draw from, especially from that account. And in any case, I urge you to read the Chronicle, because it talks also about the Battle of Stirling, for example, in the year after. But this is relatively short. It's like 5 pages, 6 pages. I don't remember how many. But it's interesting. If you know Latin, at least you can give it a read. And I leave you the link below so that you can go look at it. So, alright. I think this was enough. I know probably at the beginning, when I make these videos about battles that are kind of long stories, it takes me a lot to, especially to begin, because it's difficult to begin with. Then when you get to the development of the battle, and to the various considerations, everything is kind of easier. But at the beginning, I know it's kind of boring, but eventually I warm up a little. And alright, so okay, definitely we will come back on the wars of Scottish independence. That's a very important moment in medieval history of the and we will try to naturally to expand also on the organization of the Scottish army, and recently talked something about it. It wasn't maybe Scottish army, was about the, I don't remember. Well, there was that thing of English infantry, excuse me, that I made, that I reminded to you before. Its title being, if you're interested, medieval English infantry, late 13th century. So this kind of infantry you look at this specific battle, and we will go on. We'll talk about the broader organization, and we will look at the broader picture on another occasion. This was just about the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Alright, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.